That Saturday, when my son's friend came over, turned into one of the strangest yet most exhilarating days I've experienced. It began like any typical Saturday afternoon. The sun was setting, painting the living room in a warm, golden light. I was in the kitchen, sipping water, the low murmur of the evening news humming in the background. It was meant to be a peaceful weekend. Daniel, my son, was off camping with his college buddies, leaving the house unusually quiet. Then the doorbell chimed. I wasn't expecting visitors. I set down my glass and went to the door. Standing there was Sebastian, Daniel's closest friend. His dark eyes held a hint of uncertainty, his stance almost apologetic. "Hey, Mr. Johnson," he greeted me with a shy smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting. Daniel mentioned I could swing by if I needed anything for the trip, but I didn't realize he'd already left." Sebastian and Daniel had been friends for years. I'd watched him transform from an awkward teen into a self-assured, athletic young man. There was always something special about Sebastian, a quiet maturity in his demeanor, a genuine warmth in his smile that put everyone at ease. He'd always been respectful and considerate, the kind of friend any parent would be grateful for. "It's no trouble at all," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. "What do you need?" He shifted, looking slightly embarrassed. "Actually, I left my sleeping bag at home. I figured Daniel might have an extra." I chuckled and shook my head. "He probably does. Let me check the garage." I motioned for him to follow, and as we walked, I couldn't help but notice how much he'd grown since I'd last seen him. He was taller, broader, his shirt fitting snugly, a clear indication he'd been working out. I felt a strange twinge of awareness, which I promptly dismissed. In the garage, I sifted through a pile of camping equipment until I located the spare sleeping bag. I handed it to him, brushing off the dust. "Here you go," I said. "Daniel won't mind." "Thanks, Mr. Johnson," he replied with a sincere smile. He paused for a second, then added, "Do you mind if I hang around for a bit? My ride isn't coming for another hour, and I don't want to just sit in the car." "Of course," I said. "Come on in." We settled in the kitchen, where I brewed coffee. Sebastian leaned against the counter, arms crossed, as we talked about his classes, his summer plans, and the camping trip. He'd always been easy to converse with, thoughtful and articulate, making conversation flow naturally. But as time passed, I started to perceive something different. The way his gaze lingered a moment too long when our eyes met. The way he shifted closer as he leaned against the counter, his presence filling the space between us. I attempted to ignore it, attributing it to my imagination. But when he reached for his mug, his fingers brushed against mine, and the warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me. "Sorry," he murmured, retracting his hand quickly. "It's fine," I said, forcing a laugh. "Just clumsy." But the atmosphere was undeniably charged now, the air thick with unspoken something. I busied myself with the coffee, trying to dispel the strange sensation that had settled in my chest. This was Sebastian, my son's best friend. Whatever I thought I was feeling, it wasn't real, it couldn't be. "Mr. Johnson," he said after a long silence, his voice quieter. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," I replied, turning to face him. He hesitated, his gaze falling to the floor before meeting mine. "Have you ever felt like you wanted something you knew you shouldn't?" The question caught me off guard, and I felt my heart beat faster. "That's a pretty profound question," I said, trying to keep my voice light. He gave a small, self-conscious laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, sorry. I guess I've just been thinking about it a lot lately." There was something in his tone and honesty, a vulnerability that made my chest tighten. I wanted to ask him what he meant, to understand what was going through his mind, but I wasn't sure I was ready to hear the answer. "Sometimes we want things that aren't good for us," I said carefully. "It's human nature, but that doesn't mean we have to act on them." He nodded, his gaze distant. "Yeah, I guess you're right." But the way he looked at me after he said it, the flicker in his eyes, the way his lips parted slightly as if he wanted to say more, it left me uneasy. I turned back to the coffee pot, hoping the act of pouring us another cup would give me something to focus on. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, and I wasn't sure if it was something I could ignore. The coffee sat untouched between us as the conversation grew sparse. I could feel Sebastian's presence like a heavy weight, and every subtle movement he made seemed magnified in the silence. The quiet wasn't awkward, but it wasn't normal either. It was charged, like something unsaid was hanging in the air, waiting to break. Sebastian leaned back in his chair, stretching slightly, and I caught myself glancing at him out of the corner of my eye. His shirt lifted just enough to reveal a strip of taut, tanned skin, and I immediately looked away, my face flushing. "This is ridiculous," I thought. "Get a grip." So I said, breaking the silence, Are you excited about the camping trip? He shrugged, his lips curving into a small smile. Yeah, I guess. I mean, it's more for Daniel, really. He loves that kind of stuff. I'm just there for the company. His words made me smile. That sounds like you, I said. Always looking out for him. You've been a great friend to Daniel over the years. Sebastian looked down, his fingers toying with the edge of his mug. He's been a good friend to me too, he said quietly. After a moment of silence, he softly added, You've been good to me too. There it was again, that gentle quality in his voice, the unspoken meaning behind his words. My chest tightened as I searched his expression for a clue to his intent, but he avoided my gaze. I just mean, he continued, you've always made me feel welcome, like I'm part of the family. That's not something I take lightly. I nodded, uncertain how to reply. Well, you are a part of the family, Sebastian. At least that's how I see it. He smiled at that, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Thanks, Mr. Johnson, he said, then added almost as an afterthought. You can call me Sebastian, you know. The Mr. Johnson thing feels too formal. I chuckled. All right, Sebastian, but only if you stop calling me Mr. Johnson. Deal, he replied, his grin widening just enough to lessen the tension in the room. We went into the living room then, sitting down on the couch. The sun had gone down and the soft light from the table lamp cast warm shadows across the room. Sebastian sat at the other end of the couch, his posture relaxed, but his eyes fixed on me. Can I ask you something? He said after a long silence. Of course, Lay, I replied, preparing myself for another loaded question. Have you ever felt like there was something you couldn't say out loud, even though you really wanted to? I frowned, taken aback by the question. I think everyone feels that way sometimes, I said carefully. But sometimes saying it out loud is the only way to move on. Sebastian nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. Yeah, he said quietly. But what if saying it changes everything? His words sent a shiver down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. I shifted on the couch, suddenly aware of how close we were, even with the space between us. Sometimes change is a good thing, I said, trying to keep my voice even if it's scary at first. He looked up then, his eyes locking with mine. What if it's not? The intensity of his gaze was almost overwhelming, and I found myself looking away, unsure how to handle the sudden shift in our conversation. I guess it depends on what you're afraid of. Sebastian didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. I'm afraid of ruining this, of ruining what we have. The vulnerability in his voice caught me off guard, and I felt my heart clench. Sebastian, I began, but he cut me off quickly. Never mind, he said, standing abruptly and running a hand through his hair. I should probably go. My ride's probably close by now. I stood too, instinctively reaching out to stop him. My hand closed around his arm and he froze, his eyes wide as he looked down at where we touched. You don't have to go, I said softly. Not if you don't want to. Sebastian's gaze met mine, and for a moment neither of us moved. The air between us felt thick, electric, like the moment before a storm. Then he took a step closer, closing the distance between us. I don't know what I'm doing, he admitted, his voice trembling. I just know I don't want to leave. His words hit me hard, and I felt a surge of emotions I couldn't name. Fear, confusion, longing. They all swirled together, leaving me breathless. Sebastian, I said, my voice barely audible. We can't. I know, he whispered, but I can't help it. He reached out then, his hand brushing against mine, and I felt a spark, an undeniable pull that left me frozen. I wanted to step back to create some distance, but I couldn't. Instead, I found myself leaning into the moment, my heart pounding, and then it happened. His lips brushed against mine, not tentative, like he was testing the waters. My mind screamed at me to pull away, but my body betrayed me, frozen as the kiss deepened. The kiss lingered, leaving a weight I didn't know how to bear. The world outside seemed to disappear, leaving only the two of us in the dimly lit room. Sebastian's breath was shallow, his hand hovering near mine as if he was unsure whether to pull away or come closer. I started, but the words caught in my throat. He stepped back abruptly, running a hand through his hair. I'm so sorry, he blurted, his voice shaky. I didn't mean to. I don't know what I was thinking. My chest felt tight, my heart pounding as I searched for something to say. Sebastian, it's okay. I managed, though I wasn't sure I meant it. Nothing about this felt okay, and yet I couldn't deny the way my body had responded, the way I had leaned into the kiss, however briefly. He turned away, pacing across the room. No, it's not. It's not okay. I shouldn't have. God, Daniel would kill me if he knew. At the mention of my son, a cold wave of reality washed over me. This was wrong, so wrong. And yet the tension between us remained, undeniable and unrelenting. Sebastian, I said gently, trying to steady my voice. We need to talk about this. He stopped pacing, his shoulders tense as he turned to face me. What is there to talk about? I crossed a line. I messed up. I'm sorry. I took a step closer, my hands trembling. It's not just you, I admitted, the words feeling strange in my mouth. I felt it too. His eyes widened, and for a moment the air between us crackled with unspoken things. Then he shook his head, his expression conflicted. We can't, he said firmly. You're Daniel's dad. I'm his best friend. This, whatever this is, it's not supposed to happen. I know, I said, my voice barely a whisper, but it already has. The silence hung heavy between us. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sebastian sat down on the couch, burying his face in his hands. I wanted to say something, anything to ease the tension, but I honestly didn't know how to navigate this situation either. After what felt like forever, he looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and longing. What do we do now? I sat beside him, careful to leave some space. I don't know, I admitted, but we need to figure it out. He nodded, his gaze falling to the floor. I don't want to lose this, he said softly. Not just, whatever this is, but you, your friendship, your trust. I don't want to ruin everything. His words hit me hard, and I felt a pang of guilt for putting him in this position. Sebastian had always been like family, someone I could depend on and trust implicitly. Yet here we were, teetering on the precipice of something that could destroy it all. You're not going to lose me, I said, placing a hand on his shoulder. No matter what happens, we'll work through this. He leaned into my touch, his body relaxing slightly under my hand. You mean that? He asked, uncertainty lacing his voice. I do, I said firmly. But we have to be careful. This isn't just about us, it's about Daniel too. At the mention of my son, Sebastian nodded, his expression somber. You're right, he said. We can't let him find out. It would devastate him. The weight of that truth settled over us, a stark reminder of how precarious our situation was. But even as we sat there, wrapped in silence, I couldn't ignore the way my hand lingered on his shoulder, or the way his body seemed to lean into mine. Hours passed, and the tension between us remained. We talked in circles, trying to make sense of what had happened and what it meant. But no matter how hard we tried to rationalize it, the pull between us was undeniable and unrelenting. Sebastian, it seemed, no longer had to leave, and we talked for hours. There were moments of touch, hesitant and unintended, but the tension persisted throughout the night, a tension that hinted at more to come, and a mutual desire for it. I felt it as the clock ticked past midnight. Sebastian stood, his movements hesitant. I should go, he said, his voice heavy with reluctance. I stood too, following him to the door. Take care of yourself, I said, my chest tightening as he reached for the handle. He paused, turning to look at me one last time. You too, he said, his eyes searching mine. And thank you for not hating me. I managed a small smile. There's nothing to hate, Sebastian. Just, be careful, okay? He nodded, his gaze lingering on mine for a moment before he stepped out into the night. As the door closed behind him, I leaned against it, my mind racing with everything that had transpired and everything that might still happen. Deep down, I knew this wasn't over. The way he looked at me, the kiss we shared, the way we touched, it all told me I wasn't done with him. He had awakened something in me I'd never felt before. He was such a young, handsome guy. I was sure any gay man would be attracted to him, and I sensed he was open to it. This left me wondering how I could make this work. The days following Sebastian's visit were a blur of tangled emotions. I went through the motions of work, errands, the occasional phone call from Daniel, but my thoughts were consumed by that night. By him. I told myself it would pass, that it was just a fleeting moment of weakness. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, heard his voice, felt the warmth of his hand against mine. The weight of it all was suffocating, yet I couldn't bring myself to let it go. It was late on a Thursday when the knock came. I wasn't expecting anyone, and Daniel was still out of town. My heart leaped at the sound, a mix of anxiety and hope. When I opened the door, there he was. Sebastian. "I shouldn't be here," he said before I could speak, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. I know I shouldn't, but I couldn't stay away. The sight of him standing there, his expression a mixture of vulnerability and determination, left me speechless. I stepped aside, silently inviting him in. He hesitated for a moment before crossing the threshold, his presence filling the space in a way that felt both familiar and strange. "I've been thinking about what happened," he said as he stood in the entryway, his gaze fixed on the floor. "And I can't stop. I can't stop thinking about you." His words hit me hard, and I felt the air leave my lungs. "Sebastian, we talked about this. It's complicated." "I know," he said quickly, his voice trembling. "I know it's complicated, and I know it's wrong, but that doesn't change how I feel. I don't know how to make it stop." I wanted to tell him he wasn't alone, that I felt the same, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I reached out, my hand brushing against his arm. He flinched at the touch, but didn't pull away. "Sebastian," I said softly, my voice barely a whisper. "We can't keep doing this." "I know," he repeated, his gaze finally meeting mine. "But it's not that easy, is it? If it were, I wouldn't be here." His honesty left me exposed, stripped of any defenses. I stepped closer, my hand still on his arm. "What do you want me to say?" "I don't know," he admitted, his voice breaking. I don't want to lose you." "You won't," I said firmly, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself, but whatever this is, it can't go any further. His shoulders slumped, and I saw the weight of my words settle over him. "I don't know if I can stop feeling this way," he said quietly. Neither could I, but I didn't say it. We ended up in the living room again, sitting at opposite ends of the couch like last time. The space between us felt like a chasm, impossible to cross without repeating the same mistakes. "I've known you for so long," Sebastian said suddenly, breaking the silence. "You've always been this constant in my life, someone I could trust, someone who cared. And somewhere along the way, that turned into this." I swallowed hard, my chest tightening at his words. "I care about you too, Sebastian, but this is dangerous. It could ruin everything." He nodded, his gaze falling to his hands. "I know, I don't want to ruin anything, but I also don't want to pretend like this doesn't exist." The room felt unbearably quiet, the weight of our unspoken feelings pressing down on us. I wanted to say something, to find the right words to make this easier, but nothing came. "I should go," he said finally, his voice heavy with resignation. "Sebastian." "No," he interrupted himself, standing abruptly. "I can't stay here, not if it means feeling like this and not being able to do anything about it." I stood too, my heart racing as he turned to leave. "Wait," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He froze, his hand on the doorknob. "What?" "I don't want you to go," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I don't know what to do about this either, but I don't want you to leave." He turned slowly, his eyes wide with surprise. "You mean that?" I nodded, my throat tight. "Yeah, I do." The atmosphere in the room shifted, the air between us crackling with unspoken possibilities. He took a hesitant step toward me, his eyes searching mine for permission, for reassurance. "I don't want to make things harder," he said softly. "But being here, being around you, it's—" He trailed off. Even when I know it shouldn't, my resolve crumbled at his words, and before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us. My hand found his, and he laced his fingers through mine. His touch was both tentative and sure. "We're playing with fire," I said, my voice barely audible. "Maybe," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "But it doesn't feel wrong. Not to me." The hours that followed were a blur of whispered confessions and stolen moments. We didn't cross any lines, not really, not yet. But the connection between us deepened, growing into something that felt impossible to ignore. As dawn broke, casting a soft light over the living room, we sat together on the couch, his head resting against my shoulder. Neither of us spoke, but the silence felt comfortable, like a truce. I knew this wasn't sustainable, that we couldn't keep walking this line without it breaking. But for now, in this moment, I let myself lean into it, knowing that the real world would come crashing in soon enough. After a long silence, Sebastian said, "Mr. Johnson, I'm going to be honest with you. I really like you, and I don't want to hide it anymore. I'm still not sure how you feel about it, but I really needed to get this off my chest." In that moment, the tension shifted. I felt a surge of excitement. Sebastian had made himself vulnerable, confessed his feelings. "Sebastian," I said, "I'm so happy you're finally telling me this. I've been feeling the same way. You attract me a lot. You're such a smart, handsome, good-looking young man that it really excites me." He interrupted me, pulling me into a deep, passionate kiss. This time it was different, more intense, more intimate. It felt like a release for both of us. The kiss deepened, and after a minute of intense kissing, his hands moved to places I longed for him to touch. I let it happen. The age difference didn't matter. This was pure love. With his shirt off, I could finally admire his muscular physique. He broke the kiss and moved lower, doing things that were incredibly pleasurable. His lips were masculine yet soft, driving me crazy. It escalated quickly, and we made love. Afterward, we lay in each other's arms. It wasn't long before Sebastian fell asleep, exhausted. A moment later, I dozed off too. A couple of hours later, as the sun rose higher, casting long shadows through the living room, the weight of what we'd shared settled over us. Sebastian shifted slightly, his head still resting on my shoulder. For a moment, I reveled in the warmth of his presence, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way his hand lightly brushed mine. It was quiet, but the silence wasn't empty. It was heavy with the implications of what we'd done. Eventually, Sebastian stirred, lifting his head and rubbing his eyes. "I should go," he said, his voice thick with exhaustion. "Before Daniel comes back." I nodded, knowing he was right, but feeling the ache of the impending distance between us. "Yeah, that's probably best." He stood and stretched, the light catching his face in a way that made my chest tighten. There was vulnerability in his expression, a mixture of guilt and longing that mirrored my own. He hesitated, as if he wanted to say something, but instead he just gave me a small, sad smile. "Thank you," he said softly, for not pushing me away. I stood too, running a hand through my hair as I searched for the right words. "Sebastian, it's complicated. I don't know where we go from here, but I know I don't want to lose you. I care about you more than I probably should, but this can't be something we ignore, not anymore." His eyes shimmered with unshed tears as he nodded. "I know," he whispered, mirroring my own feelings. The air crackled between us, thick with unspoken words hanging heavy in the silence. Finally, he moved towards the door, his hand resting on the knob. "I'll call you," he said, glancing back. "Okay," I replied, my voice barely a breath. "Take care of yourself." "You too," he murmured before disappearing into the morning light. The following days were agonizing. Sebastian's absence was a physical ache, a void I hadn't foreseen. Daniel returned home unaware of the turmoil brewing beneath the surface. I struggled to maintain a semblance of normalcy, burying the emotions that threatened to erupt every time I thought of Sebastian. It was a constant battle. Each buzz of my phone sent a jolt of hope through me, only to be met with disappointment. He didn't call, and the silence stretched between us, growing heavier with each passing day. A week later, Sebastian reappeared on my doorstep. This time, there were no pretenses, no apologies. He stood on the porch, hands shoved deep in his pockets, his gaze locking onto mine with an intensity that stole my breath. "I couldn't stay away," he admitted, his voice steady yet laced with vulnerability. "I tried, but I couldn't." Silently, I stepped aside, letting him in. He walked past me, his presence instantly filling the space as if he had never left. We stood in the hallway, the weight of our unspoken feelings pressing down on us. "I've been thinking about everything," he said, turning to face me. "About you, about us, about Daniel. And I know it's messy and complicated, but I also know I can't pretend I don't feel this way, not anymore." His words cracked open something inside me, releasing a flood of emotions I couldn't contain. "Sebastian, I began, but he cut me off. "I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I just needed to tell you. To be honest with you, I don't want to hide this anymore, even if it means walking away." The thought of him leaving was unbearable. Without thinking, I closed the distance between us, my hands finding his face as I pulled him into a kiss, both desperate and tender. He responded instantly, his arms wrapping around me as if I might vanish. We broke apart, breathless, our foreheads touching. I don't know where this goes, I admitted, my voice trembling, but I don't want to lose you. You won't, he assured me, his voice firm. We'll figure it out together. The following months were a precarious balancing act. Sebastian and I navigated our feelings cautiously, concealing our connection from Daniel and the rest of the world. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, a fear of questioning whether we were doing the right thing. But through it all, we held on to each other, finding comfort in the bond we had forged. We knew it couldn't last forever, that the truth would eventually surface. But for now, we allowed ourselves to exist in the in-between, cherishing the stolen moments and quiet confessions that defined our new reality. And as I looked at Sebastian, his smile illuminating the room, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. Because some connections are too strong to ignore, too profound to deny. And this, whatever this was worth fighting for.